Those of you who are joining by Zoom, can you hear me? Could somebody write in the chat box if you can?
Your voice is very light, John.
Okay. Zach, how do we turn the volume up here?
You want to just put it
The other one.
the other one.
Is that any better? Can you hear any better now?
That's much better.
Oh, excellent. Okay, great. Well, then let's make a start. This is season what? Maybe 6 or 7, I think. It's been a long time that we've been going now. So welcome everybody to Town and Gown. Welcome back those of you who have followed this series for some time, and welcome to those who are newly joining. As Heather just mentioned, we've got a really good lineup coming this semester and into the spring as well. My job is just to quickly welcome you all. My name is John Waller. I'm the director of something called the Social Science Scholars Programme at MSU. And we work on this programme together with Age Alive, based in the College of Osteopathic Medicine. The Great Decisions Group, which is located here at People's Church, as well as Prime Time, the Senior Centre of East Lancing. So great to have you all here. I'm now going to hand over to one of our 2 new student interns, Vivian Morales, who is a wonderful member of the Social Science Scholars Programme, and she's going to now come onto the podium and introduce our speaker.
So today's speaker is Cavanagh, and she is an associate professor and the director of undergraduate education in the School of Criminal Justice. She is also a core member of the MSU Youth Equity Project, the director of the Adolescent Development and the Justice System Lab, the research advisor to the Ingham County 30th Circuit Court Family Division, and a trustee on the Lansing Board of Education. As a developmental psychologist and juvenile justice researcher, her goal is to produce policy applicable research to improve the way that the justice system interfaces with youth and their families to support healthy youth development.
Oh, thank you so much, Vivian. That was a nicer introduction than I could have given myself. So I really appreciate it. Can everyone see? Everyone can see the slides, and let's make sure I can advance. Yes. Okay, well, my first slide is going to be a brief introduction about myself, but Vivian did such a good job, we barely need to cover this. In fact, I think she listed titles I forgot that I had. But what I want you to take from this slide is that I'm a developmental psychologist who cares a lot about policy. And so my research really falls in a bunch of overlapping spheres that all are centered around adolescent development and the court system, whether that is the juvenile justice system, the child welfare system, increasingly now school systems, etc. So I'm interested in how those child-serving systems can support healthy adolescent development, which when we're talking about children necessarily includes the parenting context as well. So some of the, still figuring out how to make the slides advance. There we go. Some of the research questions that I find interesting are things like this. How can laws and policy better support youth developmental needs when they come into contact with the justice system so that everyone can work together most effectively to improve outcomes for youth? How does the family context contribute to youth offending? And then on the other side of the coin, how does youth offending reciprocally impact the family system? How do youth develop attitudes about the justice system, about the world around them? This is a concept called legal socialization that takes place largely within families. And how does the juvenile justice system serve to further marginalize youth and family, especially those who are already marginalized? So these are the questions that I'd love to say keep me up at night, but it's really more the questions that keep me going during the day. And so this is really what I'm interested in. So when I was asked to to give this presentation, I had so many different directions I could go with this talk, and so many ideas, but I'm going to focus today on the parent context for youth who have been arrested. So that's what we're going to talk about. I'll give you a brief outline. First, I'll give you just a quick overview about adolescent development in general. So as a developmental psychologist, that means I study how kids grow and change over time. And my area of specialization in the lifespan is adolescence, which is good news for me because it's also the best and most exciting part of the lifespan. So I'll tell you why. Then I'll talk about the Crossroads study, which is a big, at this point, almost 15-year-long study of youth who were arrested for the first time and their parents. So I'll introduce you to that big longitudinal study so that you understand the data I'm talking about. And then I'm going to cover two substantive portions of the talk. First, I'll talk about this direction, how parents influence youth outcomes after a youth gets arrested. So we'll talk about what that looks like in a few different ways. And then we'll flip it in reverse and we'll talk about the other direction, how youth offending, youth justice system contact affects the family context. So that's what I'm planning on covering today. And we'll start with just talking about adolescent risk-taking in general, adolescent development. So adolescence is considered a sensitive period in the lifespan. And what that means is it's one of 3 periods of time where the most brain development takes place. The first one naturally is the fetal period, because that is when a whole human person is being created. So naturally, that's going to be a peak in brain development. The brain literally has to create itself. The second sensitive period is about ages 2 to 3. As you can imagine, a lot of brain development happens then too. That is when children are learning their language. They're learning everything about the society and culture that they're growing up in, and they're also learning gross and fine motor skills. But then the third sensitive period is adolescence. So there's another peak of brain development that happens around ages 14 and 15. And a lot of what that brain development constitutes is cognition. So when we think about adolescence, we think about this period of immense change, right? Sometimes people use the word upheaval. There's a lot going on. There's social change, physical change that happens at different rates for different people. The picture that you're seeing is a real life picture of me and my friends at our 8th grade dinner dance. I am the person on the left in a navy blue dress. The thing that always stands out to me about this picture is you can tell that girls go through puberty first, because despite the fact that we are all wearing flats, we are all taller than our poor dates. So adolescence is a time when a lot of change is happening across a lot of arenas, and it might not be happening at the same rate for everyone, but it's a period of time when all of those changes are taking place. So some of those changes you can clearly see, like this picture from the 8th grade dinner dance. But some of those changes we can't see. So a lot of those changes have to do with cognitive development. That's that brain development. During adolescence, especially early adolescence, we see an improved capacity to use logic, to grasp abstract concepts. So rather than seeing the world in black and white, adolescents are able to understand shades of gray. Their cognition gets faster and more efficient. It's also more sensitive to rewards. So although they're able to process concepts faster, they're also really, really reward motivated. And a lot of times what's rewarding is friends and peers. And they also have this way more complex social cognition. So again, they find peers very rewarding. So all of this cognitive development is setting youth up to have the intellectual, the cognitive skills that they're going to need for the rest of adulthood. They're able to process quickly, understand abstract reasoning. They're able to understand sarcasm. They're able to build an argument. A lot of times when you ask people, what do you think about teenagers? The first thing that comes to mind is they're so argumentative. And that might be really annoying when you're dealing with a teenager, but I always think it's so cool and exciting because it's like this brand new muscle that they're practicing with. So a lot of that type of cognitive development happens in the teen years. However, there's another thing that happens in the teen years, and it's that a lot of risk-taking behavior takes place. And we see this across a ton of different dimensions. So here we're looking at the age curve for driver deaths, which peaks in the teen years. Here we're looking at binge drinking trajectories, also peaks in the teen years. Now we're looking at crime, both violent and nonviolent crime. We see peaks in the teen years. This is such a famous finding. It has a name in criminology, which is the age crime curve. And the reason it's famous is because it's been documented pretty much every year since the 1700s. It's been documented across gender. So here we're looking at males are the white bars and females are the dark bars. It's the exact same pattern. It's been documented across countries and cultures. Here, the light blue line is a nation of indigenous youth from the Caribbean, whereas the dark blue line is youth from the Netherlands. It's been documented, this is showing us both across different types of crime. So the top graph is robbery, then burglary, then forcible rape, and then the different colored lines are denoting years. So we've seen this exact same shape curve anywhere in the world for as long as we've been keeping records of criminal behavior. So this poses a question, right? If adolescents are so smart, I just said, they're developing all these cognitive skills, they're ready to become adults. If they're so smart, then why do they do such stupid things? Why are they taking these risks? Why are they breaking the law? Why is that happening? Well, that's because the timing of their brain development is not even. So if we think about how a brain develops, it doesn't, this is me being glib, but it doesn't like cook all at the same time, right? Different parts of it are developing at a faster rate than other parts. And the last part of the brain to develop is called the prefrontal cortex. Is what's in this white box here. So you can see if blue means fully cooked brain and the kind of red, green, yellow means not done cooking yet, we can see that in the teen brain, there's part of the brain, it's the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and it's not done cooking yet. So whereas the rest of the brain, pretty good to go, this one part of the brain really doesn't finish developing until well into the 20s. So why does that matter? Oh, here I'm pointing it out for you. Why does that matter? Well, that's the part of the brain that is implicated in what we call psychosocial maturity. So that's the part of the brain that is important for impulse control. It's important for resisting peer influence. It's important for planning for the future, thinking toward goals, perceiving risks. It reduces our sensation seeking, which is another way of talking about risk taking. So it just so happens, bad luck, well, good luck evolutionarily, but bad luck for us as a society now, that the last part of the brain to develop is the part of the brain that's in charge of these thinking toward the future, thinking about consequences, controlling impulses. So what that means for adolescents is there is literally a gap that we can document between when intellectual ability, cognitive ability reaches adult levels, which usually happens around age 16, and when psychosocial development, that kind of impulse control, resistance to peer influence, that continues to develop into the 20s. So it creates this period of time during the teenage years when the intellectual capacity might be there, but that psychosocial capacity is not there. My doctoral advisor always gave a great analogy for this. It's like starting the engine of a car without a skilled driver. So if the intellectual capacity is a brand new, fancy, top-of-the-line model car, there's gas in the car, you've got the keys, you're ready to go, but you behind the wheel have never driven a car in your life, it doesn't matter how good the car is, right? You still might crash it because you don't know how to drive a car. And so it doesn't matter if you have these intellectual capacities, if you're still impulsive and risk-taking and really focused on rewards and really interested in peer interactions, because then you're not able to necessarily harness those intellectual skills in the same way that an adult would. Does that make sense so far? Great. So let's do some concrete examples. So in my world as a juvenile justice researcher, this is a story we hear all the time. So you've got a 15-year-old, I've named him Kevin because it's my younger brother's name, and that's a fun way to get back at him. As an older sister, that's my job. So imagine you're Kevin, you're 15 years old, you're walking home from school with your friends, one of them has some spray paint. They say, wouldn't it be funny if we spray painted this building? Kevin didn't plan to spray paint the building. He just thinks it might be funny, it might be fun. Maybe he wants to impress this group of friends he's with. He's like, whatever, who cares? He's not thinking about the consequences. Unfortunately for Kevin, the police happen to be driving by and Kevin gets arrested for vandalism. I can tell you, after being in this career for over a decade, that is how a lot of adolescent crime takes place. It's not something that's planned. It almost always takes place in a group of peers. If you ask a kid who's been arrested, which I've done many times, having done lots of interviews with kids who have been arrested, if you ask them, why did you do it? The number one response they give is, I don't know. And they really mean it. They don't know. It wasn't planned. It was somebody's idea and it seemed okay and they get each other hyped up. But unfortunately for Kevin, this means that he's been arrested. What is one of the first things that's going to happen to Kevin? Someone, whether it's the police or whether it's Kevin himself, is going to call his parents. So because kids are minors under the law, their parents are involved in most of the steps of their justice system experience, which means we can't talk about juvenile justice without talking about the family context. And what's really interesting to me is the reciprocal impact that justice system contact has on that family unit. So that's what we'll be talking about today. What I'm not interested in is blaming parents for developmentally normal risk-taking behavior that kids take part in. And I think for a long time, the criminological literature, we're talking decades ago, right, was kind of like, what are the parents doing wrong, that their kids are doing this, that, and the other. We know from brain science that kids are going to take risks that might include lawbreaking. They're going to make mistakes. And rather than blaming parents, I'm interested in thinking about how can the family environment be helped by the system to be more supportive, and how can the family environment be protected from any negative impacts that the system might have on it. So that's what we're going to talk about. Okay, next I'm going to introduce this big study. So I decided to talk about a few different findings that all come from the same data set, just so I'm not explaining a million different data sets. So this is the same data set we're going to talk about this whole time. It's called the Crossroads Study. This is a longitudinal study of 312 pairs, so 624 total, of justice system involved youth and their mothers. So the youth were all males. The reason they were all males is because most juvenile crime is committed by males, so that's where the numbers are. They had been arrested for the first time ever. Usually when it's your first offense, it's something pretty low level. So most of these youth were arrested for something like petty theft, vandalism, assault, etc. They were ages 13 to 17 when they first got arrested and joined the study. The average age of about 15, and they were interviewed for 2 hours face-to-face every 6 months over the course of, at this point, a lot of years. We recruited them from 3 sites across the US to make sure that they were racially diverse, economically diverse, geographically diverse. So they came from Southern California, the New Orleans area, and the Philadelphia area. As a result, the vast majority of them were non-white, which both reflects some of the cities that we were recruiting from, and also the realities of systemic racism, which means that non-white youth are more likely to enter the juvenile justice system. Their moms were eligible for the study if they were the female guardian of an enrolled youth participant. You might ask, why didn't you invite the dads? Very similar reason to why we only had male youth, because when we asked the males, who is your female guardian, I think only 15% of them had a male to list. So we said, okay, we'll go where the numbers are. We're gonna talk to their moms. I'm gonna call them moms for shorthand, but I want to be clear that 91% were biological mothers. The other 9% might have been a grandma, an adoptive mom, an aunt, etc. And so they were interviewed for an hour over the phone, again at different intervals over the course of several years, in either English or Spanish, language of their choosing. I want to spend some time on the moms just to make sure that you know the sorts of families that were involved in the study. The majority of them did not move beyond high school. In fact, many of them did not graduate from high school at all or make it past grade school. However, almost all of them were working, whether that was working multiple jobs, working full-time, working part-time, while helping out with the family, etc. But despite the fact that almost all of them were working, this was a very impoverished sample. So we asked about their monthly household income because that's easier for low-income families to report. And the average monthly income was about $1,600 to $2,000, which if we convert to a yearly income scale is between about $20,000 to $24,000, which is well below the poverty line in the United States for a family of 4. So we're talking about a group of of families who is struggling economically in a lot of ways and is already facing some serious disadvantages when they enter the system. Okay, let's get to the good stuff. Let's get to the data. Let me know if I need to slow down, or, please feel free to interrupt me with questions as appropriate. So first, let's talk about direction number one. How does the family context influence youth when they are in the juvenile justice system? I want to give an analogy. So as Vivian kindly noted, one of my newer roles is that I am a trustee on the Lansing Board of Education, which is something I'm really excited about. And in the context of schools, it's very widely accepted that parental support equals youth success, right? So how do we get youth to do better in school? We've got to make sure their parents are engaged. And what does parent engagement look like? It looks like a few different things. Do parents value education? Are parents telling their kids it's important to go to school? Do parents know what's going on with their kids at school? Do they know if they have a quiz coming up? Do they know when the report cards come up? And also, are they putting in the effort? Are they attending the parent-teacher conference? Are they helping with the PTA? Are they checking over homework at night? So these three kind of broadly considered constructs, attitudes, knowledge, effort, is how we consider it's appropriate in a school context for families to support their kids toward academic success. Well, I would argue that the same is true in a legal context, that parental support can map onto youth success, which in that case is crime desistance rather than like graduating high school, through those same three constructs. So do parents value not breaking the law? Do they value making sure that rules are being followed? Do they know how the juvenile justice system works? Do they know what their kids' probation requirements are? Do they know who to talk to if they need a resource? And are they going to the probation officer meetings? Are they showing up for court dates? Are they putting in that effort? So my idea was, if we know in an academic context that these are the sorts of parental engagement metrics that we're looking for you to succeed, is the same thing true when a child is arrested? So we tested them. We're going to start with attitudes. So when I talk about attitudes toward the justice system, I'm talking about a sense of fairness or legitimacy that legal institutions have. And the reason this is important is because of a concept I mentioned at the beginning that I'm really interested in called legal socialization, which is where across attitudes, parents' attitudes influence their kids' attitudes. That's true of religious beliefs, political beliefs, thoughts about just gender roles and marriage, etc. And I was curious if the same thing is true for justice system legitimacy. The reason it matters is the less legitimate people think the justice system is, the more likely they are to break the law, which makes sense because if you think that a law is illegitimate, you don't really care about breaking it. So I was interested in the extent to which parents pass on these attitudes about how legitimate the justice system is to their children. This probably looks horrible to most of you. I'm putting it here only to show you kind of the background science work here. This is called the structural equation model. I teach statistics, and this is my favorite thing. We're not going to worry about it. We're gonna not focus on that at all. I just wanted to put it there in case we've got people on the call who love SEM. Instead, what I want you to focus on is these main findings, which was as moms had more positive attitudes toward the justice system, so did their sons. And as sons had more positive attitudes toward the justice system, they were less likely to report that they had continued to break the law 12 months later. So we found both an indirect pathway where moms were socializing youth attitudes, and also a direct pathway where moms' attitudes were directly impacting youth reoffending. For all of these, I'm going to put in the corner the take-home message in case you're like, I have no idea what she's talking about. So in red, you're always going to see, in red at the top, whenever I talk about a study, you'll see the main take-home thing. So the main take-home thing here is that parents socialize their kids' attitudes about the justice system, which in turn impacts if the child recidivates. Now let's talk about the next construct, which is knowledge. So here when I talk about knowledge about the justice system, I'm talking about what's accurately known about how the justice system functions. This is really exciting for those of you who are in the room because I'm going to ask for some audience participation. I'm going to ask you a series of true-false questions. There's only like 4 of them, so don't worry. So please tell me if these are true or false. If I, as the parent, pay for a lawyer for my son, I get to decide how he will plead. True or false?
False.
Hearing some falses. All right. Conversations I have with my son's probation officer are confidential or private. True or false?
True.
Hearing mixed responses on this one. Okay. A public defender is a lawyer who represents the victim. True or false?
No.
We had some strong falses in the room for this
No.
one. Okay. Juvenile records are automatically sealed, which means kept private from the public forever.
No.
Okay, mixed signals again. As you can see, some of these are kind of hard. And I developed a list of 42 items that were all true false questions. Some the answer was true, some the answer was false. And I brought them to the juvenile courts that I work with, and everyone in the juvenile court swore up and down, Cait, everyone's gonna get 100% correct. These are so easy. And then I piloted them to people in my life, and people that had PhDs, people who were parents, people who had all sorts of different expertises that would touch on this, and people did not know this information. So there's this misunderstanding from folks in the justice system because it's their career. They think everyone knows this stuff. And the reality is that people do not. So FYI, the answer to all of these was false. The reason that I chose these particular items was because these were some of the most frequently missed. So this is percent correct over here. As you can see, for example, only 30% of parents whose kids had been arrested knew that conversations with their son's PO were not confidential. So that means 70% of the parents whose kids had a probation officer were assuming that this was a confidential conversation, and it wasn't. Another almost half of parents, actually no, it was only 43% correct. Less than half of parents even could correctly identify the role of a public defender in the courtroom. So people did badly on this quiz, and I'm not blaming the people at all. What I'm blaming is, if this isn't your career, if this isn't your job, there's no way to know some of this information unless you've maybe heard it through Law and Order, or there's nothing that teaches you this information when your child gets arrested. So this is a graph showing kind of how well people did. I want to just note that the x-axis there is truncated a little bit, so it's a little disingenuous. But overall, people did not do great. The average score correct was 66% correct. And as a professor, if that were the average score on my final exam, I would be very concerned about my students. The range in percent correct was 39 to 93%. The person who scored a 93% was a professional paralegal. So she perhaps had a little more expertise than maybe some of the other people, and still didn't get 100%. In fact, there were people in the sample who would have done better if they had blindly guessed, because it was a true or false question. So we had people who scored below chance on this. So what I was really interested in was who did the worst on this? Who are the people scoring below the mean? And perhaps unsurprisingly, it's families who are already the most marginalized. So it was people who were not white. So they were African-American, they were Indigenous, they were Latinx Hispanic, they were multiracial. It was people who were not native English speakers. It was people who came from the lowest third of income and the lowest third of education. So our most marginalized families, our most disadvantaged families were the ones who had the least knowledge of the justice system, which absolutely makes sense. And again, I want to be clear that this is not a failing of those parents. This is a failing of the justice system to educate those parents. So when these parents enter the system, the onus should be on the justice system to say, here's what to expect. Like, here are the rules, here's how this goes. Because people don't enter the system knowing that. I did a follow-up study because I thought, surely, as people spend more time in the justice system, they will learn more. So we went back and gave people the same quiz 2 years later if their child had continued to be arrested. So we took only those people whose kids kept getting rearrested, and we're like, okay, you've spent some time in the system now. Maybe you know more now. Well, I told you before, time one, 66% correct was our average. Time two, 67% correct. There was virtually no movement at all. So even just kind of spending time in the system is not the way to educate parents about what their roles and responsibilities are. There has to be concerted education. It's not enough to just figure it out as you go along, because these families were not figuring it out as they went along. Okay, finally, let's talk about effort. So this is the degree of engagement that parents put into their kids' legal proceedings. This was pretty simple. We just asked the moms, hey, did you do these things? So it was things like meeting with a lawyer, going to court dates, helping with probation requirements, meeting with probation officers. And what we found was most of the moms were doing most of those things. They were pretty engaged. They were putting in a great deal of effort. The one thing they weren't doing a lot of was giving advice, which after seeing their knowledge scores, I was kind of like, maybe that's better. Should have rethought that question a bit. What was really interesting to me though, is when people said, no, I didn't meet with the lawyer. No, I didn't meet with the PO. No, I didn't go to court. I always said, why not? And the answer almost 100% of the time was I had to work. Because if you've ever spent time working with the justice system, you know that you might have a court date. It's going to be in the middle of the day. It's going to be Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. And at the last minute, it might get moved to a different day. And so parents were like, I'm only allowed to take a certain number of days off. I took the day off. I showed up. The court docket got moved to next week. I wasn't allowed to take more time off. Like I couldn't go back for the court date. So this is another kind of consistent issue that we were hearing from parents, that even if they wanted to be more engaged, they found that there were structural barriers that didn't allow them to be engaged. So here's another horrible SEM model, just in case there's an SEM fanatic on the call. But again, we're gonna ignore it. Don't worry about that. Here is what I want you to take from this. We found a mediation, which means that both mothers' legal knowledge, so how much they knew about the justice system, directly impacted youth offending. And also there was this cascading effect where the moms who knew the most about the justice system also participated more, and their youth reoffended less. So again, in red is always, if you take nothing else from this except for the red box, parents who knew more about the justice system participated more, and in turn, their kids reoffended less. So you can see how for marginalized families, the disadvantage accumulates, right? The families who are most marginalized had the least knowledge, which means that they were less up to participate and probably also had structural barriers to participating. And then their kids are the ones who are reoffending. So take-home message broadly from these studies, parents can help their kids on probation, but they have to be given the tools. And that involves treating families respectfully. That involves educating parents about what their roles are. And that involves finding meaningful ways for them to be involved that work with their lives, that are going to work with the other responsibilities that they have. Everyone with me so far? Cool, okay, final part of the talk. So now I want to talk about the opposite direction, which is the impact that justice system involvement has on the family unit. So far today, what do we know? At least I hope maybe we've learned something so far today. So far today, we've talked about how an arrest is stressful, it necessitates parental support, adolescents rely on their parents. Basically, we've talked a lot about this direction. Wait, did that much? There it is. We talked a lot about this direction. We've talked a lot about how parents can or cannot help their kids after their kid has been arrested. But what we haven't talked about at all is the opposite direction, because when a kid is arrested, it's not just a thing that happens one day. It's a process that unfolds at a minimum over 6 months, and for a lot of families, even longer than that. And what we don't know is how over time, as families are involved in the justice system, how that justice system contact impacts the family itself, the family as a unit. So particularly, I wanted to answer the question, how is youth reoffending? So as kids continue to be arrested, how is that associated with the quality of the parent-child relationship over time? So between the date that the kid was first arrested and 3 years later, at time 1, we asked both parents and kids, how warm do you feel your relationship is? And then we asked them again 3 years later, how warm do you feel your relationship is? And we had a big spread in terms of how that relationship quality changed. So some people said, about half of people said, I actually feel that we have a warmer relationship now than we did before. Other people said it hasn't changed at all. And other people said the warmth has actually decreased. We asked the same thing for hostility. Hostility is not the opposite of warmth, because a relationship can both be warm and hostile, or it can be both like cold and not hostile. So these are not opposites, even though they move kind of in the same direction. So same thing, we asked parents and kids right after the kids were arrested, how hostile is this relationship? And then we asked them again 3 years later, how hostile is it? And again, we saw a pretty big mix, some no change, some decrease, some increase. And we wanted to figure out what that was associated with. So what's causing this change over time? Well, what we found was that as youth continued to get arrested, so on the x-axis at the bottom, we have number of additional offenses committed after the first one. And then on the y-axis, we have the score from 1 to 4 about relationship warmth and hostility. And what we found was that as kids continue to get arrested, the relationship is less warm. And as kids continue to get rearrested, the relationship becomes more hostile. The reason that this matters is because a very clear finding in the juvenile justice literature is that something that protects against reoffending is a warm relationship. And so this creates this vicious spiral, right? Whereas kids can continue to get rearrested, it erodes this very important relationship warmth that might have kept them from further offending. I was also interested in how this varied over age. Oh, sorry, I think my colors didn't come through very well here. I hope you can still see it. So we looked at this by age as well. And what you can see is they're supposed to be lighter green bars getting darker green. The lighter green bars are older kids. The darker green bars are younger kids. And what we found was that this was a steeper decline for younger children, which makes me really sad. So what this says is if your kid is 17, they keep getting rearrested, the line's basically flat. Like the relationship got a little less warm, but it's kind of like, well, he's 17, what are you gonna do? But for the 13-year-olds, there was this really steep drop off of warmth as their kid kept getting arrested. And again, the reason that I found this so interesting and so troubling is because we talk a lot about early intervention. Oh, with the young kids, we've got to intervene early. And these young kids, as they made mistakes, as they kept getting arrested, they were eroding one of those very important early intervention things, which is a strong relationship with their families. So I got really interested in how parents think about their kids' age as it relates to offending, and what that means to have a younger child who is heavily involved in delinquency versus an older child who's heavily involved in delinquency. Oh, sorry, I skipped right over our take-home message. Take-home message here is that parent-child relationship quality worsens as kids reoffend, and that was especially true for younger children. Anyway, I got really interested in this idea of your kid's age and how that makes you feel about their futures. And you know what, I'm gonna skip that slide. And I'm going to skip this one too. We're going to move right to this one. So something important to keep in mind is that parents have aspirations for their kids' futures, right? Parents have ideas that they want their kids to accomplish. And when parents have low expectations for their kids' futures, the kids are not likely to do well. That's true across contexts, right? So if parents think, I don't think my kid's very good at school, the kid is less likely to graduate from high school. And just in the same way, if parents say, my kid's going to keep getting in trouble forever, then they are more likely to keep getting in trouble forever. Whereas parents who have high expectations for their child's futures, that's associated with a ton of good outcomes, better behavioral health, better academic achievement. And so I was interested if that was also protective against reoffending in the same way. Does that make sense? I know I skipped some slides because I want to make sure we get to discussion. Okay, cool. So what about when things don't go smoothly? Because we know adolescents make mistakes. Does that make parents consider their kids' futures differently? And does that matter by age? Yeah. Again, I know I'm going a little fast because I want to get to the end. But hopefully you're with me here. So here on the y-axis here, we've got two groups of people. So remember, everyone had been arrested once. That's how they got into my study. And some of them were never rearrested again. That was the only time. And some of them were rearrested multiple times. So we're comparing those two groups. Everyone been arrested once. Some of them, once was enough. Some of them kept reoffending. And then on the y-axis, on the left side here, we have mom's expectations for their son's future success. And I'm going to show you some bars in different colors. The pinkish bars are going to be younger kids, and the bluish bars are going to be older kids. And what we find is for older use, rearrest didn't really have any impact on mothers' expectations. It looks like the lines are going up a little bit, but statistically it's a flat line. So as kids continue to get rearrested, it didn't really matter. So if your 17-year-old's been arrested a bunch of times, not only does it not really change your relationship warmth, it also didn't really change how well you thought that kid would do in the future. But for these younger kids, as those youth continue to get into trouble, their expectations for their kids' future decreased. So what that means is, for those younger kids, as they continue to get in trouble, not only was the relationship less warm, more hostile, but also parents started to kind of give up on them and just say, you know what, I don't have that high of expectations for them anymore. Because remembering, we're asking parents every 6 months, these same questions. And so we can track over time how this changes alongside arrests. And we're going to skip that too, actually, except for the red box part. Parents' expectations for their kids' success declined with rearrest, especially for younger children. And the reason that matters is because lowered expectations in turn continue to feed that same behavior. So just like we were talking about with relationship warmth and hostility, it creates this spiral where the very thing that kids need to succeed, which is this warm relationship and these high expectations, that very thing is getting eroded as they continue to get into trouble. So it creates, again, this spiral, this amplifying effect. And the reason it's troubling is because it seems to be particularly pronounced for younger kids, which are the very kids that we want to intervene with the most, right? Because we want early intervention. Okay, so let's get to my big take-home message so we can get to some question answer. My big take-home message, this is probably clear, is that justice system involvement and family life are inextricably linked. You cannot separate one from the other. First of all, legally, you literally cannot separate one from the other because kids are minors. But also emotionally, it is not possible to separate the impact of one on the other in either direction. It's not possible to separate how well a kid does on probation or how successful a kid is in recidivating. You can't separate them from their family context, just as you can't separate the justice system experience from what that family context looks like. Those two are intertwined. And this has huge developmental implications. It means that because parent relationships are pivotal to healthy adolescent development, it means that when we talk about juvenile justice system involvement, a lot of people are really focused on, oh, if kids, are involved in the justice system, it might mean that they're less likely to graduate from high school, or it might mean they're more likely to get involved in drugs. It also might mean that they long-term suffer damage to their family relationships. And those are relationships that are hugely important to identity development as kids transition into adulthood, and are hugely important to their success as young adults who are trying to set up their lives. So as we talk about the impact of the juvenile justice system on youth development, it's impossible not to talk about how part of that healthy development includes the family context and includes parenting relationships. That makes sense?
No.
Okay, I'm putting my email address and also my website here in case anyone wants to write it down. The website, I wouldn't say I keep that super up to date, but it's up to date within the last few months. So it's where you can learn more about some of my work. And if you'd like to email me if you feel shy about asking questions, then that's great. Or if you think of a question later, I'd welcome that. But now I do want to make sure that we have time for questions here. So take it away.
Yeah. Can I ask something?
Yes, of course.
Okay. It's really hard for me to formulate this, but I'm thinking of this can be more, a parent's approach can be more nuanced than just anger, warmth, or anger. It's like, I can think of several levels with, I'm glad my sons didn't get into trouble, but let's say if they brought into the system for something, I have at least 3 approaches. One is, you really didn't do anything wrong and I'm going to help you get off. And the other is, yeah, you did something wrong, but I'll still try to get you off because it was no big deal. And the third would be, hey, you really did something wrong and you're going to have to pay for it somehow. So I'm thinking, how do these things fit into your models?
Yeah, I love that you asked that. So that was actually part of my dissertation work, which I didn't present because without giving away my age at this point, that was a while ago. So what we did as part of that work was do interviews with parents where we qualitatively coded how they thought about their kids' arrest. And we found some of those exact themes. So some parents were very defensive of their child and said, you know, he did nothing wrong. Some of them said, I mean, it's important to learn a lesson. Some of them were much more like, nope, this is a consequence you have to face. Others felt ashamed or embarrassed, as though, you know, their friends might judge them, or members of their extended family might judge them for their parenting ability. And so we saw a lot of those complex and nuanced emotions when we asked parents how they feel about their child's arrest, just asking that open-ended question. How do you feel about the fact your child has been arrested? How do you feel, how has your family life changed since your child has been arrested? So that's a separate study that didn't present today, but absolutely we see a wide range of reactions from parents that we can sort across a bunch of different reactions. And sometimes parents are having multiple reactions at the same time, right? Sometimes they're angry and they feel ashamed, or sometimes they feel defensive of their child, but also angry. Sometimes they feel really scared or really sad. One thing I didn't present is within this sample, we had a pretty significant chunk of participants where at least one family member was an undocumented immigrant, and that came up for a lot of people. They were really concerned about that undocumented family member getting exposed to the system kind of indirectly through their child's getting arrested. So those sorts of things came up that I wouldn't have thought of when I started the project. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Family reactions to these sorts of things are very, very complex. And of course, for the sake of a quick presentation, it's easy to break it down into, you know, here's a handful of graphs. But when we're talking about human beings and their emotions and their families, it's way more nuanced.
Okay, thank you. Oh, and the next thing would be then, how does that contribute to their reoffending or not?
Honestly, not necessarily. What we found was that people just kind of had human reactions. It did impact how families felt about the justice system. So the parents who were very defensive of their child, they showed a decrease in how legitimate they thought the justice system was over time, which then, you know, could have indirect implications for their child and their reoffending. But no, parents were having reactions that weren't necessarily related to their child's reoffending.
Okay, thank you.
We do have a question.
Oh, okay. Does the data, I'm going to read it out loud. Does the data as a whole across various topics discussed very largely depending on the severity of crimes, speeding tickets versus manslaughter, or does the percentage self-similar? Yeah, so this was something we considered when we were designing the study. So we made sure that people who were eligible for the study had only committed a set of pretty similar low-level offenses. So they were all first-time offenders, and all of the offenses, it was like a list of, you know, it's penal codes, so the list is quite long, but the actual, if you distill it down, the number of offenses is quite small. But it was things like vandalism, petty theft, assault, underage drinking, things like that. So we made sure to account for that so that we weren't comparing people who had, you know, a minor truancy charge to people who had committed homicide. So we made sure that that was even across all of the people so that we had a good comparison group of low-level first-time offenders. There is a study like that, though, like what you're describing. It's called Pathways to Desistance, and it was done in the early 2000s, and that looked at serious youth crime, and kind of similarly, that didn't have a parent component, but it similarly asked a lot of the same questions. We borrowed a lot of the questions from Pathways when we made Crossroads, and so that was looking at serious youth offenders and how they transitioned from adolescence into adulthood. So if you're interested in those more serious offenders, if you Google Pathways to Desistance, it's a really famous study and you'll find a bunch of stuff.
Davidson has a question.
Okay. Did you evaluate abusive criteria? Did you evaluate PTSD, loss of a family member, violent or otherwise, divorce? Yes. So many things. This is a question with a lot of components, so I'm going to do my best to answer all of this. So first of all, abuse criteria. Yes, there's a whole separate part of the study where we went to child welfare in each of the cities that we were working with, and we pulled child welfare records for all of our kids so that we could see who was what we call dually involved. So dually involved youth are involved in the justice system in two ways. First, as a perpetrator, so they've been arrested for a crime, they're in the juvenile justice system, and then also as a victim. So they've been the victim of a crime, therefore they're in the child welfare system. So we coded for abuse stuff, abuse, neglect, domestic violence, etc., using those official child welfare records. And in fact, I have a doctoral student right now her whole program of research is about dually involved youth. And so she's a great resource for that sort of research. But yes, as part of Crossroads, we did pull child welfare records. As you can imagine, there's a great deal of overlap between youth who are involved in the juvenile justice system and the child welfare system. That's true not just in this study, but across the country. That's extremely common. So yes, that was something we coded for. PTSD specifically, no. However, you're asking about exposure to violence, and that we did ask about. So we asked about experiencing violence and being exposed to it. So I think it was a list of maybe 20 different violent acts. And so first we asked the youth, has this happened to you? And then we asked, have you seen it happen to someone else? So that we can both test how much they've experienced violence and how much they've witnessed violence. And there's some really interesting studies that we're working on looking at that information, because as you can imagine, also strongly related to things like attitudes about law enforcement, strongly related to things like reoffending, strongly related to mental health concerns, etc. You also asked about divorce. And you said child's feeling of responsibility. I assume you mean child's feelings of responsibility for the crime. We asked about both of those. A lot of the demographic characteristics, so things to do with how many people live in the house and divorce, etc. A lot of that really isn't associated with as much as you would think. In part, that's because a lot of these families are pretty non-traditional. And so it's not that there was high rates of divorce, but perhaps that there was very low rates of initial marriage. So I don't really have any exciting findings to share about divorce. But in terms of child's feelings of responsibility, that's a funny one. So at the beginning of the talk, when you're talking about adolescent development, I said, if you ask a kid who just got arrested, why did you do it? They say, I don't know. It's pretty similar for feeling of responsibility. If you ask a kid, why did you do it? They say, I don't know. If you ask them, did you do it? Was it your fault? They say, yeah, I guess. And so there's not a lot of what we call statistical variability in the responses that we get for that, because the kids are kind of across the board, just kind of non-committal. And that is developmentally normative. They're telling the truth. They're not lying. They're not trying to dodge. They're really kind of not sure how they made a series of impulsive and risky decisions that got them to this particular place where they hadn't really thought through the consequences. So we did ask them about feeling of responsibility, and we kind of just got a shrug every time. So yes, but I promise it's a giant study with a ton of variables. Are there other questions in the chat?
Yes.
Okay.
Are juvenile justice professionals aware of these?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked. My favorite part of my job is working with local courts. So in my previous life before MSU, I partnered with the courts that we got this data from. And so we would have an annual retreat where we would do a huge, I mean, like all day long presentation, but we would also write them technical reports and briefs every time we completed another set of analyses so that they would know. And the thing I am maybe most proud of ever in my career was I felt very strongly about the legal knowledge project, as maybe you could tell, because that was the thing that the court professionals had been like, no one's going to get any of these questions wrong. They're so easy. And so I felt very vindicated when I was like, actually, people did really bad on that. And so one of our partner courts started a pilot program where they had me create a booklet that's like, hey, your kid's been arrested for the first time. Welcome to the juvenile justice system. Here's some things you might want to know. And we just gave that booklet out to everybody. And they found that bench warrants, which is where a kid gets an additional charge tacked on because they didn't show up for court, bench warrants went down like 87%. Because then parents knew, they knew what a bench warrant was. They knew that they had to make sure their kid got to court. And so that simple intervention of just making this very small booklet to hand out in this partner court really was quite an amazing transformation. Here, since I've been at MSU, I know that Vivian mentioned kindly in her introduction, I'm the research advisor for the 30th Circuit Court, which is the juvenile court, the family court for Ingham County. So we have a great partnership. We meet every other week, me and the court managers, the court administrators, the managers of the juvenile correction officers, juvenile court officers. So we have regular meetings. They provide me with access to their data so that they can bring questions to me that then my team analyzes and directly feeds back to them. So you may remember a couple years ago, Michigan raised the age of juvenile jurisdiction. You might have heard of raise the age. What that means is that the age at which a kid counts as a juvenile versus adult, it used to be in Michigan, weirdly, if you were 17 and you got arrested, even though 17 is still a minor, you were charged automatically as an adult. And so they raised the age of juvenile jurisdiction to be 18. I'm belaboring the point, but the point is the partner courts came to me, the Michigan Association for Family Court Administrators, as well as the local court in Ingham County. They came to me and they said, what's this going to mean for us? Can you do an analysis to figure out how many more kids we're going to have to serve so that we can make budget decisions about what that'll look like? So I do that sort of research all the time. It's separate from my academic research that I publish into studies. It's what we call academic outreach. And I do that all the time here in Ingham County, and it's my favorite part of my job. So I really appreciate that question. Other questions in the chat? No? Okay. Okay.
Cosmo, I hope it can be heard through the Zoom. Interested and troubled by the withdrawal of warmth from the kids who offended repeatedly from an early age. Is there anything that is different about those kids? Do those kids disproportionately come from more disadvantaged areas than those who were repeat offending when they began at about 17?
We didn't find much in terms of demographics that would explain that trend. We did do a different study trying to get at, I think part of what you're going for is there's something kind of different about those kids that isn't just that they were younger, where we looked at what's called callous unemotional traits. This is sometimes in pop culture called psychopathic traits, but so if you hear someone's a psychopath, the science term for that is callous unemotional traits. So we did a study of use callous unemotional traits to see if are there kids who are just difficult for parents to get close to because they have these callous unemotional presentations. And honestly, what we found was that the better predictor of kids' callous unemotional traits, or the thing that was most related to kids' callous unemotional traits, was parents' callous unemotional traits. So, which I guess is unsurprising, but was kind of a different direction than we thought that particular study would go. But to answer your question, is there something qualitatively different about those kids? As far as we could find within the study, which of course no study is perfect, you can't include every variable, but as far as we could find, the thing that distinguished them was that they were younger, and that parents simply lowered their expectations because they're if they're 13 and already been arrested a bunch of times, I guess I shouldn't have very high expectations for them, which means I shouldn't get very attached. So as far as we could find, that was the conclusion we drew. Of course, in science, nothing is definite, so I don't want anyone to take that to the bank, but that is what the results of our particular study would suggest. Other questions?
I think I have two questions that kind of are back to back. I'm not too familiar with the juvenile justice system,
okay.
But would you say that it's different with county and state? Do they have different procedures? Because I'm wondering if you're more likely to face being rearrested if your court system valued rehabilitation versus valuing just being behind.
Awesome question from Vivian. So Vivian's asking, does juvenile justice vary between jurisdictions? Yes. One thing that's very different about the adult court system and the juvenile court system is the adult court system, we have a federal system, right? So we have the same set of laws. There might be some laws that are different state to state, but we have a federal system that says these are federal crimes and this is how these federal crimes are going to be treated. There is no federal juvenile justice system. Juvenile justice is entirely managed by the state, and within states, it's almost entirely managed by counties.
Okay.
So in Michigan in particular, as I've worked with a few different counties in Michigan, and everything from what penalties look like for the same crime to how long youth are on probation for, to what is the standard for considering a child high risk, to how long do we put somebody in short-term detention. That varies really widely, even within a state, from county to county. So yes, those things are very different. Sometimes in juvenile justice, that's called justice by geography, because you can get arrested for the same thing in different states or even different counties in the same state and perhaps have a very different experience. And so on the one hand, you might say, that's terrible, but I want to explain where that comes from. Because the outcome, yeah, is terrible. But where it comes from is that the juvenile justice system, unlike the adult court system, is supposed to be rehabilitation focused. And the idea is that in order to be rehabilitation focused, we have to introduce discretion to the system so that we can account for youth's very specific, social ecological needs and risks and their strengths, etc. So it's considered a positive thing about the juvenile justice system that we're treating the individual rather than treating the crime, whereas in adult court, no matter what your background looks like, if you've done the crime, this is the punishment. In juvenile court, there's a lot more room for, well, yeah, that's what you did, but like, let's look at you holistically. So it comes from a very positive place. And that's a debate that comes up a lot in juvenile justice, is how do we balance discretion and making sure that we can look at kids holistically with due process, making sure that people are getting fair outcomes. Because whenever discretion enters a system, a decision-making system, that means that there's room for bias. Because if people have discretion when they're deciding, they can introduce their own thoughts and their own opinions. So yeah, that's a huge debate. There's no perfect answer. There's never going to be a research study that says here's the right balance of discretion versus due process. But yes, that's a long answer to your question, but you're hitting on a really important debate in the field. Oh yeah, sorry.
Have you looked at parental attitudes toward kids who have been incarcerated as opposed to those who have committed a low-level crime?
So have we done this kind of same sort of work with kids who are incarcerated? We are doing it now. So I've got a collaboration in Texas with Texas Department of Corrections. That is primarily what that study is about, is how long-term incarceration for kids disrupts their sleep. So it's a collaboration with a sleep researcher. And she was like fascinated when I was telling her how, oh yeah, if you're arrested, it doesn't matter if you're a kid, they'll leave the lights on all night and they're doing bed checks once an hour. And she's like, but kids need sleep. And I'm like, well, sorry. So we started a study in Texas where she lives to look at the effects of long-term incarceration. But I, as somebody who's interested in parents, was like, can we add a parent component? So that study launched in 2020. You can imagine how well that got off the ground. So we've had a bit of a slow start, but we are collecting data there. It's going to be a 3-year study. Even though it's been going on for more than 3 years, we just haven't quite gotten to a place where we have enough families enrolled that we can analyze data yet. But yeah, that's coming, the impact of long-term detention and how that relates to family context. Yeah.
This isn't necessarily, this is about some of the things you said at the very beginning. I'm concerned by the fact that it's males that are the most that are affected by this. And by the fact that you're saying in their homes, there's not so much a father present. So I want to understand, is there a correlation that because there's no father in the home, these young boys are more likely to get involved?
That's certainly a potential question. That's a sociology question.
Right.
So as a psychologist, I study like individuals, and you're asking a societal question.
Well, I guess I'm looking at all this and I'm thinking, so what do we do to help the situation? And so, right, it's not your.
Certainly. And so that can be hard, right? Because it's hard to intervene in someone's family life and say, this is how you need to structure your family. It has to look like this.
Right.
So my answer to what do we do about this? My answer is to intervene at the level of the system and see how the system can be more supportive. So my answer as like a juvenile justice system person would be to say, well, let's think about how we can better support families so that it's a better situation for families to have two parents. What can the justice system do to do that? But it's hard to say on the individual level how to make that happen. I'm sure there's research out there about exactly what you're saying, but it's a different field than mine. So I'm not trying to not answer your question, but I don't have a great answer for it. But yeah, in general, most crimes are committed by young men, teenage men, and men in their early 20s. And there's been many different explanations for that. Is that a genetic brain development thing? Are men evolutionarily more predisposed to take risks? Is it a societal thing, which is what you're hitting on? So those are questions for other fields to answer. But yeah, you're hitting on some big points here. Whenever we're talking about these large systems and really complicated structures, social structures, it's hard to find just a single answer, a single solution.
Dave also said, what about size of the family? But I'm not sure what that would be referred to.
Okay, so we have a question in the chat that says, what about the size of the family? And I am going to use this opportunity to shamelessly plug my next venture, which is what I'm really interested in is sibling relationships. So Dave, I'm sorry if I'm totally hijacking your question here, but oh gosh, you don't have to show the slide, it's just this. So I recently got some seed funding from the Youth Equity Project to look at how the sibling dynamic is impacted when a kid gets arrested. So we talk a lot about how important peers are to kids, but one of your most important peer groups is your siblings that are similar aged. And in fact, those are peers that you can never get away from for your whole life. And in the adolescent development literature, generally, there's a lot of research about how positive sibling relationships are good for things like academic outcomes and well-being, etc. But I don't know hardly any juvenile justice research that has grappled with the idea of siblings. So what does it mean for the sibling who has not gotten arrested when they have a sibling who does, etc.? How, to Dave's question, hopefully, how does that get more complicated as we're talking about larger families where there are lots of different sibling dynamics? Do the non-arrested siblings get closer? If there's multiple arrested siblings, did they get closer? And what sparked this interest in me is because in the study Crossroads, sometimes we would have participants who we had to exclude from the study because they had gotten arrested with one of their siblings. And so we're like, okay, but we need you and a parent, and it can't be like both of you with the same parent. And so there are siblings who might get arrested together. There are siblings who don't get arrested together. There are siblings who serve as an example to other siblings. To one of the earlier questions, when you're talking about families, really nuanced reactions, a lot of times parents would say, I just hope that, you know, the younger siblings don't take the wrong message away from this. So I'm really interested in sibling dynamics, which is another aspect of family dynamics, but, you know, makes the whole thing a bit more complicated. So in terms of size of the family, I'm not sure if I'm answering that. I don't know of any research. I certainly haven't done any that's just like, is bigger family equal into, you know, whatever outcome? I'm not aware of that research. But as you can imagine, because relationships are complicated and messy and nuanced, as we talked about, it gets more messy and nuanced as we add in additional family members and how that network of people are all interacting with each other.
Another question if I may. You, for doing this kind of research, you're obviously interacting with a lot of different prosecutors. How much discretion do you see them having? And are there any ways to rein in prosecutorial discretion so there is more consistency from one court to another?
Sure. So what you're asking is about prosecutorial discretion, and that system only exists in the adult court. So kids would only interact with the prosecutor if they are waived to adult court, which only happens if they've committed a very serious offense. So somebody asked earlier about like homicide and manslaughter. If a child commits a very serious offense, then they might get waived to adult court. So even if you're 16, so you're a minor, you should go to juvenile court. But if it's something really serious, you get waived. Then you would be talking to a prosecutor. And that is work that I don't do because I don't deal with the adult court. In the juvenile court, the person who has the most discretion, all the discretion, is the judge. So a juvenile court judge is like start to finish, that's the person. Excuse me. They are the decider. They decide whether to bring the charges. They decide, you know, how the youth is going to be adjudicated. There's a different language around juvenile justice. So we use the term like petitioned and adjudicated rather than like found guilty, or, you know, so it's the judge who has a lot of that discretion. The judge is the one who decides what what we would call a sentence in adult court. The judge is the one who are making those decisions. And to your point about, is there a way to kind of rein in that discretion? It's that way by design. So the idea is that if in the adult court, we've got this adversarial system where it's the defense versus the prosecutor, and they're fighting and fighting and fighting, and then the truth will emerge through that conflict. If anyone's been to law school, that's kind of what you're taught, and that's justice. They fight until from the conflict emerges the truth. In juvenile justice, the thought is to not have an adversarial system. So youth who go through the juvenile justice system are not represented necessarily by like a defense attorney that's going to go up against the prosecution. They have a defense attorney that is going to kind of present to the judge, hey, here's some information about this case, and then the judge is the one who decides. So it's a non-adversarial system. So that kind of answers part of your question. But your other question about how do we rein in that discretion? A lot of family court judges are elected. And so if you are a person who votes, which you should be, then make sure when you are voting for judges, especially family court judges, that you're looking up their philosophy and you're looking up kind of their history and background, because that can sometimes tell you a lot about how they plan to handle cases. So there is a way, and it's through voting. But otherwise, yeah, judges have a ton of power in the juvenile justice system, which to Vivian's earlier point is by design. We want them to have that discretion because it's considered, they're considered like a benevolent parent figure in the initial conception in 1890 of the juvenile court out of the kind of reform era. I digress. So it's not a prosecutor, it's a judge. They have a lot of discretion. That's by design. If that's a problem for you as a citizen, then make sure you're looking up the family court judges on the ballot. Yeah.
As a psychologist,
yes,
how many cases are you seeing where someone has a single interaction with the juvenile justice system and that's it, and they decide they're not going there again? Their decision making, what's involved in that decision making?
So I'm going to answer your question in two parts. So first, you're saying basically, are there people who reoffend once then never again? Yes, and in fact, that's like probably half the sample. So of these kids who are first-time offenders for a low-level offense, like half of them, because as I said, we follow up with them every 6 months, and now it's been many years, and so some of them are like married with kids, and they're like, why are you guys still calling me about this? No, of course I haven't been arrested. That was one time, I was 14. So certainly that happens for a lot of people. But what I'd push back against is you characterize that as a decision. And what we know about adolescent development is that their decision-making is not very good, right? So they're impulsive and they're risky and they're sensation seeking. And so I don't know that I would characterize it as them consciously saying, I'm not going to do that again. Maybe in some ways they're kind of learning from their mistakes, but I think that it oversimplifies what we know about adolescent brain development to say that it's a conscious choice that some people are making that other people are not making. Because I don't think it's fair, because the converse of what you're saying, right, is other people have decided to continue offending. And it's usually not a conscious decision to continue offending. It's just kind of something that keeps happening as they continue to make impulsive decisions. I referenced earlier from one of the comments about Pathways to Desistance, the very similar study of serious youth offenders that doesn't have a parent component that we borrowed a lot of questions from. In Pathways, they found that one of the best predictors, so they followed kids who were a bit older and had done a bit more serious crimes. So I think they were like ages 16 to 30 by the time the study was done. And they found one of the best predictors of how kids stopped reoffending was that they simply grew out of it. Like their brains developed enough that they just stopped making risky decisions. It wasn't anything else that they could possibly put into the model or control for or ask about. It was just that once their brains were more fully formed, once they were more ready to step into, adult life, then they desisted. There's some literature in the criminology world about how taking on adult roles is a way out of crime. So as people are like, oh, well, I kind of want to have a family, or, I kind of want to have some money, then they might desist from crime. But that tends to happen as their brains are more developed anyway. So that psychosocial maturity and brain development is one of the best predictors of getting out of crime. And unfortunately, that means that sometimes it's not necessarily a conscious decision, if that makes sense. It's just like waiting. Any other questions? I know we're probably out of time, but.
Yeah, thank you for a really wonderful presentation. It was brilliantly clear.
My pleasure to be here, and thank you to everyone on Zoom. I feel like I'm looking at the camera, so I hope that from your perspective, I'm making eye contact. But thank you to everyone who was able to be on Zoom as well. I really appreciate it. I'm always happy to share my research. And as I said, feel free to email me or to look me up and follow up with more questions later. I'm happy to engage with questions after tonight.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Now that the meeting's over, can I ask